The first rafts were woven in desperation, lashed from milk jugs, battered buoys, and nets emptied of the last Atlantic cod. By the time the storm season of year 22 arrived, the rafts had accreted into bergs, white only where barnacles calcified the seams, otherwise a kaleidoscope of detergent blue, cola red, and warning orange. Wind drove the flotilla north, into currents once sealed by ancient ice. Here, amid fogs that smelled faintly of brine and petrochemicals, the refugees declared their purpose. If land and law had dissolved, they would preserve at least the sentences that remembered both. They called their refuge the Kodak's Shelf, a pun whose irony no one missed. Along the outer bulwarks they mounted solar sails and turbines, cannibalized from pleasure yachts, then stacked shipping containers in tiered crescents. The mid-levels held cramped dormitories, mess halls, stills that wrung potable water from vapor. At the very base, half submerged, churned the grinders that chewed newly collected waste into shapes resembling pack ice. But in the penthouse, where salt storms could not bleach spines and mold, found no purchase rose the floating library there. Books were shelved not by author, title, or even language, but by buoyancy. Slim poetry chapbooks near the ceiling, ponderous encyclopedias strapped to the floor like ballast. Neve was the youngest archivist to earn an orange armband stitched with the symbol of an open palm. At 17, she had already grafted more metadata onto the shelf's log than many elders managed in a decade. Her notebooks, waterproof rice paper pages bound in paracord, bulged with careful diagrams. Which crates still lacked humidity beads? Which fonts smudged under the new antifungal varnish? She catalogued without complaint, night after night, while above her head gulls circled like errant punctuation marks sewn onto the gray sky. What drew Neve to such work was not only duty. She loved the hush that formed wherever print congregated. On decks where welders shrieked and children squabbled over dried algae cakes, words lay in wait for anyone patient enough to peel back a cover. She believed, as most aboard the Shelf did, that civilization's rescue might begin not with steel, but with a well-placed sentence. Yet some mornings, when her eyes blurred from micro-fissures in brittle paper, she wondered whether survival also required forgetting. The Shelf floated through a season of relative calm before trouble announced itself in the form of silence. Messages broadcast across the shared shortwave band began to arrive with gaps. Entire nouns replaced by static, verbs by whistling hiss. A weather station on Spitsbergen observed that its automated log, when printed, appeared in runnels, as though the ink itself were sweating. Fisherfolk still anchored to what remained of the Norwegian coast reported overhearing conversation in which final syllables sloughed off and puddled on the deck like spilled tea. Neve noticed first in her own voice. She was reading aloud the manifest of a newly hoisted crate, 17 copies, Encyclopiet, 2036 edition, fair condition. When the word Britannica slipped, not mistakenly, but physically, it dripped from her tongue, a cold slick vowel that splattered onto the page where it soaked into pulp, erasing itself. She slammed the manifest shut, horrified, and wiped her lips on her sleeve. A faint smear of printer's ink remained. Before panic could spread, Captain Atholayan convened a midnight assembly in the amphitheater, a domed shelter of scavenged skylights. "Sound is failing," he said, voice enlarged by the cone of an antique megaphone rescued from a maritime museum. "But written word will hold." Elder librarians nodded, yet their accord was fragile. For in quiet corners the pages they revered were graying, fonts feathering at the margins, as if trying to migrate off the paper. 2 days after the assembly, a patrol tug hauled in a sealed cedar chest, bobbing amid shards of bottle caps. The chest lacked marking or lock. Its seams appeared fused by sap and salt. Neve was assigned to the intake crew. As they pried the lid, a gust of cedar dust coughed out and hovered, forming for an instant what looked like letters, though none recognized the script. Within lay a solitary volume, cloth-bound, midnight green, unwarped despite its voyage. No title graced the cover, Yet Neve felt the subtle thrum of words, like a hummingbird trapped beneath cloth. Back in the archive's dry room, she donned nitrile gloves scented faintly of peppermint oil, a trick to deter paper lice, and examined the book. When she opened it, the text rearranged before her eyes. Letters unfixed themselves, swam, regrouped. She called for the senior archivist, Maribel Tan, but by the time Maribel arrived, the lines had congealed into a stable, if archaic English. The first page offered neither preface nor author, only a proclamation. There shall come a second flood, not of water, for water is spent, but of the word itself. Language will lose its shores, meanings will deliquesce, tongues shall dissolve upon utterance. Prepare vessels not of timber, but of memory. Maribel stiffened. A hoax, she declared, some eccentric theologian printed prophecy on reactive ink. But her tone lacked certainty, and she assigned Neve to a private study of the object. Discreetly, she warned. We don't want hysteria unspooling faster than sentences already are. Neve carried the volume to her cubicle, whose walls were lined with polycarbonate sheets, salvaged from defunct greenhouses. Overnight, she pored through chapters that refused fixation, phrasing mutating each time she blinked. Yet a core message persisted. Language was entering a state change as surely as ice passes through melt into vapor. The author or authors claimed the first flood, the one etched in so many mythologies, had stripped Earth of innocence. The second would strip it of syntax. Only those who learned to anchor words in new substrates would stay articulate. She looked up from the final folio, dazed, and realized dawn had broken. Frost glazed the skylights, but she felt hot, as though fevered. When she drank, the water tasted of varnish, and she worried that her mouth, her thoughts, had begun their own liquefaction. A week later, evidence mounted beyond debate. The shelf's daily ledger printed at sunrise appeared smudged by noon. Children's songs lost their choruses. Jokes dissolved before punchlines. Even the gulls' cries seemed blurred, attenuated. Captain Athalion, unable to rally the people by speech, ordered announcements to be displayed on woven plastic banners with stenciled glyphs and arms width high. Yet the paint bled, dripped, until each alert resembled rainfall caught mid-air. In emergency council, the elders turned to Neve, because only she had studied the cedared book. She recounted its forecast while the refugees huddled beneath squeaking lights. So we become like fish? A welder scoffed, words half strangled already, mouths opening, nothing heard. Not fish, Neve replied, forcing clarity into each syllable. We could become like water, yes, but water can be held, it can be frozen. She tapped the book's cover. We need a deep cold, colder than any external storm, a place where meaning can crystallize. The shelf possessed freezers, but their power could not be spared. Instead, Neve proposed constructing an inner berg, a nucleus of compressed plastic and scavenged refrigerant coils, within which sentences might be rescued. You want us to build an iceberg of words? Captain Athalion asked. Exactly. A lexicon glaciers. Approval came by a shaky show of hands. Work began that same shift. Fabricators melted poly scraps into hollow bricks, then injected them with aerogel harvested from decommissioned insulation. Refrigeration engineers rewired coolant lines from obsolete medical pods. Every participant donated one treasured object for barter with the shelf's dwindling fuel reserves. Charms, heirloom watches, even the last unaired denim jacket. Soon, the half-formed core towered amid the archive stacks, a translucent monolith pulsing with blue light. They christened it the Glossary. While welders sealed seams, Neve and a cadre of scribes undertook the most desperate salvage mission yet. They scoured the shelf for any expression still solid enough to copy. The charcoal graffiti etched on rain barrels, the embossed address plates prized from suitcases, the faded web addresses on solar array housings. She descended below waterline to the old grinder bays, where microplastic flakes floated like snowstorms, each shard once part of a consumer label. An advertisement, a shipping receipt. She brushed handfuls into vials, imagining the embedded lexemas, frag, cola, caution, unyielding resurrection. One evening, hunched over a workbench, she discovered that the motes clumped into recognizable forms when chilled. First a lowercase e, then an ampersand. She flashed with wonder. Perhaps the plastic itself, the waste humanity had poured into the sea, was now the best seedbed for language. She adjusted the freezer's thermostat, and the letters held fast, sparkling like candy. While Neve experimented, Maribel combed the prophecy for instructions. Between mutable paragraphs, she extracted a diagram of concentric rings labeled with symbols predating any known alphabet. At the margin, Neve annotated, "Could these rings be resonance frequencies? Vocal patterns to rephrase speech?" The notion inspired a new layer to the glossary: acoustic baffles carved from basswood salvaged off a derelict violin factory. If spoken inside the core, words might imprint upon the chilled air, returning tongue and mind to coherence. But time was sliding, phrases sluicing away. One dawn, the shelf awoke to find the directional signs port, starboard, galley rendered blank. The infant's babble ceased to coalesce into any pattern. Terror gnawed at the refugees like barnacles at hull plates. What if even memory unspooled, until they forgot why building had seemed worth doing? Neve confronted her own dread during a dive to retrieve copper wiring. As she rose through the water column, she glimpsed her reflection in a porthole, mouth agape, bubbles, forming shapes she could not name. For a heartbeat, she forgot the word face. Only when her head broke the surface did vocabulary sluice back, fragile as frost. The glossary neared completion none too soon. Its innermost chamber, kept at -20°C, featured shelves molded directly into ice-lined walls. Every phrase still recoverable was engraved onto bioplastic slates with a laser the Safe Harbor shipyard had once used to etch serial numbers. Short oaths, lullabies, instructions for planting barley, all were archived. The prophecy book itself occupied a pedestal at the chamber's heart, clamped beneath a crystal bell jar. On the eve of activation, Captain Athelayan asked Neve to inscribe a dedication. Her pen hesitated, ink had grown treacherous. Instead, she fetched a stylus and scored into soft plastic the sentence, "Here dwell the words we are, the words we may become." At midnight, the coolant pumps were switched on full. Pale rime crawled outward from the glossary, crawling over graded walkways, frosting the spines of waiting volumes. Condensation beaded in the air, then crystallized like snowflakes mid-slight and drifted to the deck in near silence. Outside, the sea hissed, perplexed by the sudden micro-winter. The first test came at dawn. Neve stepped into the chamber, breath forming plumes that snapped into glitter. She spoke her own name. The syllables formed visible crystals, tiny six-pointed stars, that drifted a moment, then adhered to the wall, twinkling. She exhaled, laughter shaking in her chest. "It works," she mouthed, and the consonants struck, chiming faintly like glass beads. Members of every language group aboard filed in, repeating greetings, proverbs, laments. Soon the walls sparkled with polyglot frost remnant. Outside the glossary, meanwhile, conversation still guttered, but hope rekindled. Yet resilience invited retaliation from the unraveling world. A storm system, birthed from divergent jet streams, gained ferocity and barreled toward the shelf. Forecast charts, now nothing but smeared gradients, were useless. Barometers trembled. The air thickened with metallic tang. Refugees braced moorings, stacked sandbags of shredded tarp. More than seawater threatened. They feared the tempest might accelerate the dissolution, rendering the glossary impotent. Amid preparations, Neve realized the glossary's vulnerability. Should the hull fracture, cold brine would surge into the core, warming it by mere degrees, enough for stored words to melt. She recalled a half-translated margin note in the prophecy. The true ark floats within its archivist. Was the book instructing literal ingestion? Absurd yet. Her instinct insisted. Portability. She convened a meeting of scribes. They could not rely solely on static storage. They needed vectors, human bodies able to carry frozen language into catastrophe, and they had scant hours. From the freezer they retrieved mouth-blown vials sized like lozenges. Into each they funneled slivers scraped from the frost. Screens sealed them with wax mixed from candle remnants. Scribes memorized which vial held what phrase, drilling as actors rehearse a play. They tucked the capsules under tongues, between cheek and gum where the cold stung but preserved. Nev claimed the prophecy itself. She chipped a shard from its crystalline script and placed it beneath her left molar. A line from the book pulsed against her palate. "Remember, utterance is water seeking level." She swallowed, as if taking communion. An icy path traced down her throat. When the storm struck, it arrived not in roaring squalls but in near silence, as though sound had already fled. The sky projected a tapestry of gray ribbons moving too swiftly to focus on. Rain began, not drops but threads, each filament a sentence come undone. They coiled around rigging, looped through open hatches, seeking ears to drown. Deck planks darkened where the linguistic rain pooled, and once solid nouns unraveled underfoot. A wrench labeled 19 shed its stenciled ID. In seconds it was mere metal. Panic rippled. People shouted but produced only plumes of steam. Neve anchored herself inside the glossary's mid-chamber. She felt phrases dissolving in her mind, the mental architecture of each language slumping. She bit down, releasing the shard. Cold rushed upward, frosting her teeth. She spoke one word, "hold," and the single syllable detonated into a visible glyph, freezing the spray around her. Others followed suit, spitting their vials like seeds. Each released phrase blossomed in midair, geometric snowflowers of meaning that repelled the rain. A lattice of words assembled over the glossary, crystalline and multilingual. Swahili interlocked with Finnish, Urdu braided through Quechua. Storm filaments touched the lattice and disintegrated, like hot ash meeting lake ice. Below, refugees stood mesmerized as their lost speech reverberated back, solid, melodic. The storm raged 3 hours more, but its power ebbed as the lattice thickened. By the time sun disked through thinning clouds, the shell floated within a dome of syntax, bright as hoarfrost. Drifts of defeated rainfalls slumped harmlessly against the plastic bulwarks, indecipherable. In the aftermath, survivors gathered on the top deck. No one spoke at first, testing whether silence would swallow them. Then a small girl recited the codfish-counting rhyme, and the words held. A retired lawyer offered a toast in Latin, its declensions rang accurate. A folion wept, unashamed, each teardrop catching glints of the vocabulary shield overhead. Maribel knelt beside Neve at the glossary's entrance. "The book chose well," she said. Nev shook her head. "We chose. The book only offered a path." They inspected the lattice. Already some crystals sublimated in warm sunshine, drifting upward like dandelion seed heads. Nev felt surprisingly calm watching them depart. "Let them go," she murmured. "Words must travel." In the weeks that followed, the shelf evolved. The glossary remained, now a sanctum for periodic harvesting. Phrases were refrozen, compressed, and blown skyward to reinforce the ever-expanding dome. Refugees developed ritual sports of word-catching sailors snatching falling idioms with butterfly nets, children pressing them into scrapbooks. Lingual diversity surged. People traded expressions as once they had bartered fruit, and Neve, whose left molar throbbed whenever a new frost script formed, assumed the role not merely of archivist, but of seeder. She voyaged in a coracle woven of soda bottles, venturing to neighboring rafts rumored adrift. Wherever she sailed, she carried pouches of microplastic letters. She would speak them onto a cold surface, nurse them until they crystallized, then teach the refugees there how to cultivate their own glossaries. Sometimes, on tranquil nights, she opened the midnight green prophecy now stable, its text fixed by the glossary's chill. The final page, once unreadable, had resolved. In the beginning was the word, and the flood proves the word still becomes. Fear not the melt. Speak, freeze, release. Nev closed the cover gently. Around her the ocean heaved beneath a sky riddled with starlight and drifting semicolons of ice. She inhaled salt, plastic, and the faint fragrance of cedar. Words lined her lungs like bright fish schooling in the dark, ready for whatever tide came next.